The first thing Elena Marisol Torres noticed was not the sound. It was the hesitation. In the vast hangar beneath the pale, coastal morning light, a fighter jet sat surrounded by ground crews, support personnel, and operators preparing for a scheduled launch that everyone expected to move forward without delay. Engines were quiet for the moment. Radios carried clipped updates, and the entire facility seemed to move with the confidence of a machine that already knew its purpose. But Elena, standing near the edge of the maintenance corridor with a worn clipboard in her hand, watched the aircraft's movement differently. She had spent years learning that machines rarely announced their problems. They revealed them in patterns. Elena was not the person whose name appeared on mission briefings. She was not the person who gave launch orders or stood at the center of operational decisions. She was the senior hangar mechanic, the person people called after something went wrong. Yet before the aircraft ever left the ground, she saw something that made her stop. The jet was turning differently, only slightly, almost too slightly for anyone without her experience to notice. The response was delayed by a fraction, the kind of detail that could disappear beneath urgency, confidence, and a schedule that was already moving. Around her, the airfield continued forward. The launch window was approaching. The SEAL support personnel moving through the hangar were focused on their assignment, their attention fixed on timing and coordination rather than the quiet observations of a mechanic standing beside the maintenance line. Elena looked down at her notes from the previous inspections, then back at the aircraft. The numbers were not alarming by themselves. The individual checks had passed. The reports had been signed. But the combination of small details bothered her. A temperature change, a repeated correction during movement, a response that did not match the aircraft's previous behavior. She had learned long ago that failures rarely arrived as dramatic moments. They usually began as things people decided were too small to matter. Torres, someone called from behind her. Elena turned and saw Commander Nathaniel Cross walking toward the launch area. He carried the calm focus of someone responsible for keeping many moving parts aligned at once. He was not careless. He was not dismissive by nature. But like many people in positions of command, he had learned to prioritize what could be seen immediately. Elena understood that her concern would have to compete with a clock. "You have something?" Cross asked. Elena glanced once more at the aircraft before answering. "I have a concern." The words sounded smaller than what she felt. That was the problem. In places like this, confidence often carried more weight than caution. A mechanic's warning could become a delay. A delay could become a question. And questions before launch were rarely welcomed. "What kind of concern?" Cross asked. Elena looked toward the jet and then at the maintenance record in her hand. She did not accuse anyone. She did not claim certainty she did not have. She simply pointed to the inconsistency she had found. The turning response is not matching the expected behavior from the last verified checks. For a moment, the noise around the hangar seemed to fade. Not because everyone believed her, because everyone had heard her. A few nearby personnel looked over. Some were curious. Others were already calculating the cost of stopping something that had been prepared for hours. Elena knew that look. She had seen it before. The look that said expertise mattered, but timing mattered more. The aircraft remained ready. The launch sequence continued, and, standing beside the machine she knew better than almost anyone in the room, Elena felt the familiar distance between being responsible for finding problems and being trusted enough to influence decisions. She tightened her grip on the clipboard, the small metal maintenance tag attached to it tapping softly against the surface. Twice, a habit she had developed over years of checking details others overlooked. She looked back at the jet as the first movement began. The aircraft started toward the launch position, and Elena saw the same hesitation again. The aircraft stopped only for a moment before the launch preparation continued around it. To everyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. The schedule was still intact, the teams were still moving, and the pressure of the morning remained exactly where it had been. But Elena knew the difference between a machine that was ready and a machine that was simply expected to be ready. She stayed near the maintenance boundary as personnel moved around the aircraft, waiting for the opportunity to explain what she had seen. Commander Nathaniel Cross did not ignore her completely. That was what made the situation harder. He listened. He asked questions. He considered the possibility. But consideration was not the same as authority. Around them, the launch window continued to shrink. Major Victor Halden, the aviation operations officer responsible for keeping the schedule moving, stepped closer and reviewed the situation with the confidence of someone who had already seen hundreds of successful preparations. He did not insult Elena. He did not need to. The structure around her already made the point. He was the person responsible for operations. She was the person responsible for maintenance observations. Torres, what exactly are you seeing? Halden asked. Elena kept her answer precise. She described the difference in the aircraft's movement, the inconsistency between expected behavior and what she had observed, and the reason she believed the detail deserved another look. She did not claim the aircraft was unsafe. She did not pretend to know everything. She simply refused to pretend she had not noticed anything. Cross looked from Elena to the aircraft. How long would a full review take, he asked. It was the question everyone in the hangar was waiting for. Not whether she could be right. Not whether her experience mattered. How much time would believing her cost? Elena knew that question because she had heard versions of it throughout her career. A maintenance concern was always measured against something else. A schedule, a mission, a deadline, a person's confidence. I cannot give you a final answer without looking closer, Elena said. Halden exhaled quietly. And that is the problem. We have a launch window based on confirmed checks, not uncertainty. The words were professional, but they carried the weight of a decision already forming. Several SEAL personnel nearby glanced toward the conversation. Some recognized Elena as the mechanic who kept aircraft running behind the scenes. Few saw her as someone whose judgment could influence what happened next. That gap was familiar. Elena had spent years building expertise in a world where mistakes became visible only after they happened. The best maintenance work often ended with nothing happening at all. No emergency. No dramatic moment. No recognition. Just another successful day. She looked at the aircraft again. The same aircraft that had passed inspection. The same aircraft everyone trusted because the paperwork said it was ready. Her concern was not about proving she was smarter than everyone else in the room. It was about whether everyone was willing to admit that a record of success did not guarantee a future result. Cross made his decision. Torres stepped back from the launch line. The instruction was calm, controlled, almost respectful, but Elena felt the familiar weight behind it. Access removed. Responsibility limited. The place where she had the most knowledge was the place where she now had the least influence. She handed over the maintenance notes for review, but kept the original copy of her observations. Not as a challenge, as a record. The launch team began reorganizing around the aircraft without her involvement. The people who had spent years depending on mechanics to solve problems after they appeared now moved forward without the mechanic who believed a problem was already appearing. Elena stepped away from the active area and watched through the hangar opening. The aircraft remained still for the moment, surrounded by people who believed they had accounted for every possibility. But Elena noticed one thing before she turned away. The same small hesitation she had seen earlier appeared again. This time, it lasted just long enough for her to know she had not imagined it. And this time, she was no longer close enough to do anything about it. Elena remained outside the launch boundary long enough to see the aircraft disappear behind the movement of people and equipment around it. From a distance, the hangar looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Coordinated, controlled, professional. That was what made the feeling in her chest harder to explain. Nothing about the scene suggested panic. Nothing suggested failure. Yet she knew the difference between a calm operation and a calm assumption. She returned to the maintenance area where her access was still permitted, though her influence had been reduced. The technicians working nearby did not avoid her, but the conversation had changed. Before, they asked what she had noticed. Now, they asked what she had written down. It was a subtle shift, but Elena understood it. Her observations were becoming paperwork instead of a warning. She opened the maintenance records again, not searching for a mistake, but searching for a pattern. Her strength had never been memorizing every component or claiming to know more than everyone else. It was recognizing when separate details that seemed harmless began pointing in the same direction. She compared the recent inspection notes with previous service history. The individual reports looked normal. Each entry had a reason. Each check had been completed. But the aircraft's behavior during movement did not match the confidence written across those pages. Elena traced the timeline quietly, marking only what she could verify. She refused to turn uncertainty into accusation. That discipline was one of the reasons some people trusted her. It was also one of the reasons others underestimated her. She was careful. She did not make dramatic claims. In a world where confidence often arrived before proof, restraint could look like hesitation. Chief Aviation Technician Marcus Bell found her reviewing the records alone. He had worked around enough aircraft to understand that experienced mechanics sometimes notice things that were difficult to explain immediately. "You still think there's something there?" he asked. Elena looked back at the hangar doors, where the launch preparation continued beyond their view. "I think we're looking at separate pieces instead of the whole picture." Bell did not immediately agree, but he did not dismiss her either. That was the first small change. Not trust. Not yet. Just attention. Elena continued reviewing the information available to her, aware that she was walking a narrow line. She had already been removed from the launch area. She could not make the decision for the people outside. She could only make sure that if they eventually asked what she saw, she had an honest answer ready. Minutes passed. The pressure inside the facility increased. The launch schedule moved closer. Personnel who had previously been focused on Elena's concern began watching the aircraft more closely. Not because they had accepted her conclusion, but because they had started noticing the same unanswered question. The jet's movement had been recorded. The maintenance history existed. The process had been followed, and yet the small inconsistency remained. When another ground movement check produced the same unusual response, the conversation changed. Elena was no longer the only person describing the problem. She was still outside the decision circle, but the circle itself had become less certain. Commander Cross returned to the maintenance area with a different expression than before. He was not convinced. He was not admitting fault, but he was no longer asking Elena to simply step away. "Show me what changed," he said. Elena looked at the aircraft records in her hand. For the first time that morning, someone with authority was asking the right question. She walked him through what she had observed, what had been confirmed, and what still remained unknown. She did not have the final answer. She did not have the power to stop everything on her own. But she had something more important than being believed immediately. She had a reason that could be tested. And as the aircraft remained waiting at the edge of launch, everyone in the hangar began to understand that the question was no longer whether Elena Torres had noticed something unusual. The question was why nobody had noticed it before. Commander Nathaniel Cross did not ask Elena Torres to repeat herself. That was the first difference. Earlier that morning, every question had been about whether her concern justified slowing down the launch. Now, standing beside the maintenance records while the aircraft waited beyond the hangar boundary, the question had changed. It was no longer about whether Elena had enough authority to speak. It was about whether the information she had brought forward could be ignored. Elena pointed to the sequence of observations, careful not to exaggerate what she knew. The aircraft had passed its scheduled checks. The records were complete. The people who signed them had followed the process they were given. But the behavior she noticed did not disappear simply because the paperwork looked clean. Cross studied the information, then looked toward the launch area. The pressure around them was growing. Every person involved understood what a delay meant. A mission timeline could shift. Personnel coordination could be affected. Decisions made in quiet rooms suddenly became visible when everyone was waiting for movement. Major Victor Halden arrived before Cross could respond. His expression was controlled, but his position was clear. He was not arguing that Elena lacked skill. He was arguing that skill had limits. "We have verified checks," Commander Halden said, "and we have a mechanic asking us to reconsider based on a concern that has not been confirmed." Elena heard the words beneath the words. A concern, not an observation. A mechanic, not an authority. She had spent years hearing the difference. Her work kept aircraft ready, but the decisions about readiness belonged to people farther away from the machines themselves. Cross looked between them. If we pause, what are we looking for? Elena answered honestly. The reason the response is inconsistent. And if we continue? Holden asked. Elena did not answer immediately. She knew the danger of sounding certain when she was not. But she also knew the danger of pretending uncertainty meant nothing. Then we accept the condition we have not fully explained. The hangar became quieter for a moment. Not silent, just quieter. The kind of pause where people realized the conversation had moved beyond a mechanic questioning a schedule. The aircraft itself had become the center of the debate. Cross made the decision to hold the next step and allow a closer review before anything moved forward. It was not a victory for Elena. She knew that immediately. The people around her were not suddenly convinced. Some were relieved. Others were frustrated. The launch had been interrupted because one person refused to ignore a detail that others considered too small. Elena understood what came next. Questions. Accountability. Responsibility. If the problem was nothing, she would be remembered as the person who created unnecessary delay. If the problem was real, she would still have to explain why she was the only one who raised it. The inspection began under growing pressure. Elena stayed nearby, but remained careful not to take control of a process that was not hers to command. She watched. She answered questions. She provided context when asked. The aircraft technicians checked the information against what they could observe, and the concerns slowly became more difficult to dismiss. The unusual response was not a random feeling. It was connected to something measurable. The realization moved through the group quietly, not as panic, as recognition. Elena had not found a dramatic failure waiting to happen. She had found the beginning of one. For a brief moment, she saw the people around her differently. They were no longer watching her as someone slowing the mission. They were watching her as someone who had noticed a problem before it became impossible to ignore. Then the next question arrived. Who had approved moving forward despite the warning? And Elena knew the answer could change everything. Because being right about a machine was one thing. Proving that the right people had listened was something else entirely. The question hanging over the hangar was no longer whether Elena Torres had noticed something unusual. It was whether the team was willing to accept what that observation meant. The aircraft remained where it had stopped, surrounded by people who were no longer moving with the same certainty they had carried earlier. The launch schedule was still pressing. The mission still mattered. But the confidence that everything had already been accounted for was gone. Elena stood beside the maintenance team as they reviewed the aircraft's behavior, aware that this was the moment where her role could easily be misunderstood. She was not the person in command. She was not making the operational decision. She was not trying to replace the people responsible for moving the mission forward. She was doing the one thing she had always been trained to do. She was listening to the machine. Chief Aviation Technician Marcus Bell compared the current observations with the available maintenance history, and the more they looked, the clearer the pattern became. The problem was not a single obvious failure that would have announced itself to everyone. It was a combination of small inconsistencies that only became meaningful when viewed together. Elena had not found the answer because she had more authority. She had found it because she had spent years paying attention to details that disappeared when everyone focused only on whether something had passed or failed. Commander Cross watched the process quietly. Earlier, he had seen Elena as someone raising a concern. Now he saw someone who had preserved a chain of thought before the pressure of the launch could erase it. "Walk me through what you need," Cross said. It was a simple sentence, but Elena understood what had changed. He was not giving her command. He was giving her access. For the first time that morning, her expertise was being invited into the decision instead of being evaluated from the outside. Elena looked at the aircraft, then at the people around her. She knew this was the moment where she could either make the situation about herself or keep it about the machine. She chose the machine. She explained the specific behavior that had concerned her, the previous observations that supported it, and the reason she believed the aircraft needed a closer technical review before moving forward. Halden remained skeptical. "You are asking us to stop a launch based on an interpretation," he said. Elena met his eyes calmly. I'm asking us not to ignore information because it arrived from the wrong person. The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. The room already understood the meaning. The maintenance team continued their evaluation. The aircraft's response confirmed what Elena had been tracking since the beginning of the morning. The issue was real. The launch could not continue as planned. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not because Elena had won an argument, because the decision in front of them had changed. The person who had been removed from the launch area was now the person helping everyone understand why the launch had stopped. The shift was quiet, but everyone could feel it. The SEAL personnel nearby, who had originally viewed Elena as support staff standing outside the operational circle, began asking questions differently. They asked for her assessment. They listened for her explanation. The difference was small from the outside, but Elena felt it. Respect was not always announced. Sometimes it appeared in who people chose to hear. Cross gave the order to keep the aircraft grounded until the issue was fully understood. It was not a celebration. It was not recognition. It was a decision based on responsibility. Elena looked down at her maintenance clipboard and tapped the metal tag twice. The sound was almost lost beneath the activity of the hangar. The aircraft had not moved. The launch had been delayed, and the mechanic everyone had asked to step aside had become the person standing closest to the answer. But as the teams began documenting what happened, Elena knew the hardest part was still ahead. Finding the problem was only the first battle. Explaining why it had been missed would determine what happened next. For Elena Torres, the hardest part was not proving that the aircraft had a problem. It was accepting that proving the problem did not automatically prove everything else. The review room was quiet in a way the hangar never was. There were no engines, no movement, no pressure from an approaching launch window. Only records, observations, and the uncomfortable process of determining how a warning became something serious before everyone reacted. Elena sat with her maintenance notes in front of her. The same notes that had been questioned earlier. The same notes that had eventually stopped the launch. But she knew better than anyone that being correct did not remove every consequence. Major Victor Halden focused on procedure. He explained that the launch team had acted based on the information available at the time. The aircraft had passed checks. The schedule had been approved. The personnel involved had followed their responsibilities. Elena did not disagree. That was what made the conversation difficult. She was not trying to prove that everyone else was incompetent. She was trying to explain that a system could function correctly and still miss something important. Commander Nathaniel Cross reviewed every stage of the timeline. When Elena raised the concern, when the concern was considered insufficient, when access was limited, when additional observation confirmed the problem. The sequence mattered, not because Elena wanted someone punished, because sequence showed where communication had broken. The review panel asked Elena why she continued pushing after being told to step away. She considered the question carefully. Because the responsibility to notice something does not disappear when the authority to decide belongs to someone else. Nobody answered immediately. The sentence stayed in the room because it represented the real conflict. Elena had not wanted control. She had wanted connection between expertise and decision-making. Still, the consequences arrived. Her launch-related duties were temporarily restricted. A preferred assignment was no longer available. Some people who respected her technical ability still questioned whether she had handled the situation correctly. That was the part nobody saw from the outside. The victory was not clean. The machine had been protected, but Elena had still paid a price. Chief Aviation Technician Marcus Bell returned with additional information from the maintenance history. Previous records showed small irregularities that matched Elena's concerns. Not enough individually to create alarm, but enough together to explain why her instinct had been correct. The evidence did not make Elena the hero. It did something more valuable. It showed that her decision had been based on professional judgment, not emotion. Cross looked through the completed timeline again. The question had changed. It was no longer, why did Elena stop the launch? It became, why did the process make it so difficult for Elena to be heard before the launch reached that point? The Aviation Safety Review reached the point where assumptions could no longer carry the weight of decisions. Inside the review room, the people who had watched Elena Torres step away from the launch area now sat with a complete sequence of events in front of them. The aircraft had not failed because someone ignored a warning intentionally. It had reached a critical moment because a warning from the person closest to the machine had not been given the same attention as a decision from someone farther away. Elena stood beside the records, but she did not stand there as someone asking for praise. She explained the timeline exactly as it happened. She described what she noticed, what she could confirm, and what she could not. She never changed her words to make herself look more certain than she had been. That restraint was part of what made the room pay attention. Chief Aviation Technician Marcus Bell confirmed the maintenance history supported Elena's observations. The ground crew confirmed they had noticed the same unusual behavior once they knew what to look for. The records did not create the solution. They simply showed that Elena's decision had been based on a real concern, not personal judgment or hesitation. Major Victor Halden remained silent for several moments before defending his earlier position. He argued that the launch team had followed established procedures and acted with the information available at the time. Commander Nathaniel Cross acknowledged that. The review was not about creating a villain. It was about identifying where the process had failed. Then Cross addressed the part that mattered most. Elena had been removed from the launch area because her role was considered too limited to influence the decision. But that same role had given her the perspective needed to recognize the problem before it became a larger failure. The room changed in a way Elena noticed immediately. The people who once watched her from a distance now looked directly at her when they discussed the aircraft. The shift was not dramatic. Nobody applauded. Nobody treated her like a legend. It was something more realistic. They adjusted their understanding of who deserved to be heard. Cross made his decision publicly. He accepted responsibility for allowing operational urgency to outweigh technical input and changed the launch review process so qualified maintenance specialists would have a direct place in future readiness discussions. Then he turned toward Elena. "Your work was never the problem," he said. "The problem was that we waited too long to ask for it." For Elena, that sentence carried more weight than any award could have. The wound she carried was not about wanting control. It was about being invisible until something went wrong. Now, the people who had once viewed her as someone standing behind the mission were recognizing that she had always been protecting it. The consequences for Halden were handled through formal administrative review. His authority over launch approval was removed while the process was examined. But Elena did not receive the impossible reward of having every lost opportunity returned. She still had missed assignments. She still had a reputation to rebuild. The difference was that she no longer had to fight for permission to be heard before every decision. Later, as the hangar returned to its normal rhythm, Cross stopped beside the aircraft and asked Elena to participate in the next readiness discussion. Not as a favor, not as an exception, as part of the process. Elena looked at the jet that had started everything. The machine had not needed a hero. It had needed someone willing to notice what others overlooked. And now, for the first time, the people responsible for sending it forward understood that listening was part of readiness too. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. The weeks after the review did not transform Elena Torres's life into something effortless. That was not how real recognition worked. The aircraft had been protected. The process had changed. The people around her understood her role differently. But Elena still remembered the morning when she stood outside the launch boundary, because her expertise was considered something to consult later. The cost remained. Her temporary restriction stayed in her record. The assignment she had hoped to continue was gone. Nobody erased those facts simply because she had been right. Commander Nathaniel Cross understood that better than anyone. When he changed the readiness process, he did not present it as a reward for Elena. He presented it as a correction for the organization. Maintenance specialists would be included earlier. Technical concerns would be discussed before they became emergencies. The goal was not to create a system where mechanics overruled commanders. It was to create a system where the right information reached the right people sooner. That distinction mattered to Elena because she had never wanted authority for its own sake. She wanted responsibility to match reality. When she returned to the hangar, the environment looked almost identical. The same lights, the same aircraft, the same constant movement. But one thing had changed. People asked questions before they made decisions. A technician reviewed a maintenance note and asked for Elena's perspective. A coordinator included her assessment in the preparation discussion. Small moments, but important ones. Elena took out her clipboard and looked at the worn metal maintenance tag attached to it. For years, it had represented the quiet work nobody noticed. The inspections completed before problems appeared. The details recorded before anyone needed them. She placed the corrected maintenance card beside the aircraft checklist. This time, they were not separate documents belonging to separate groups. They were part of the same decision. Elena tapped the clipboard twice. A small habit, a reminder to herself that careful work still mattered even when nobody was watching. Around her, the final review continued. Every responsible person signed. Only after the process was complete did the aircraft begin to move. Elena walked quietly, not because she had defeated anyone, not because the past had disappeared, but because something important had changed. The people around her no longer saw maintenance as the last step before a problem. They saw it as part of preventing the problem. And for Elena Torres, that was enough. Not a perfect ending, a better system, a place where her voice did not need a crisis to become valuable.